So, the lecture right now is on early colonies. So, these were some of the first countries and people to come to the Americas, or the New World as they called it back then. So, originally, people in Europe didn't really know about America. It was kind of unexplored territory because of the fact that most people originally believed the earth was flat. Can you believe it? Flat. However, as tales from a man by the name of Marco Polo, um, he was able to write a book talking about his exploring of Asia in Mongol territory. And because of all the riches and stuff that he talked about them having, many people were anxious to trade with them. And so a man by the name of Christopher Columbus took a special interest in being able to trade with them and had this idea that he could travel westward as a shortcut to get to Asia, specifically to get to India. And so he tried to find somebody to fund his voyage. Now, his own country wouldn't do it, but eventually he was able to convince the Spanish king and queen to fund his voyage. And so what he did was he set sail with a small fleet and sailed westward. Now, it was a long, hard voyage, which eventually he landed on what is now considered the Caribbeans, or the Caribbeans. So they began to look for gold. However, there was already a native people there, or Native Americans. These people were called the Taino people. However, there was a friendly reception at first, as the Taino people had been extremely nice and willing to essentially give the Spaniards anything that they needed. Well, back home in Spain, this sparked a huge interest in this area and going this route. Christopher Columbus, however, thought not that he reached the Americas or a new world, but he believed that he reached India. Hence the reason why we often call Native Americans Indians, even though they're not from India. So what ended up happening, though, was that they would exchange goods with back home in Europe. This became known as the Columbian Exchange. However, the Native American population in the Caribbeans quickly died off due to diseases such as smallpox, malaria, etc. So, whereas the Colombians had begun to use the Taino people as slaves to work their crops, they no longer could because of the fact that many of them were dying off due to disease. Thus enters the slave trade, or the beginning of the slave trade. So they began trading slaves into the Caribbeans to work their lands. Well, afterwards, another Spaniard set out with his military force to explore this new world. Because even though Columbus never figured out that he wasn't actually in India, many began to realize that this was actually a new world and not a quick route to the old world, part considered to be Asia. So this new explorer by the name of Hernan Cortez set out to check out this new world as well and claim pieces of it for Spain. So he brought his soldiers with him that was called conquistadors and landed in southern America in the area that we now consider to be Mexico. So, when he encountered the people in Mexico, it was the Aztec people. So they were a strong empire with a strong ruler. However, Cortez essentially seemed almost like a god to them at first because they had never experienced people with armor and the weaponry like what Cortez and his men had. However, due to disease and the advanced weaponry of Cortez and his people, they were eventually able to capture the central city in the Aztec Empire. Now, these were built like fortresses and big temples and stuff, but what Cortez and his men did was after they were able to capture the empire, they destroyed it, and instead, on the ashes, the rubble of the old empire, they built what is now Mexico City. The next explorer to come to the Americas was Francisco Pizarro. Now, Pizarro set sail also searching. He had heard rumors about cities of gold and stuff and wanted to try to find them for himself. He set out with conquistadors as well and eventually landed in what's now considered to be Peru. So, much like Cortez, Pizarro also ran into a native group that was already inhabiting this area, namely the Incas. But unlike Cortez, the difference is that disease had already struck the Incas prior to Pizarro actually getting there. So a lot of the population had already been wiped out. Then to top that off, he captured the Inca leader and essentially said, give me a bunch of gold and jewels and stuff, and I'll give you back your leader. The Incas complied and gave him what he asked for, and he killed their leader anyways. So then, being devastated by disease, being leaderless, and having been divided, Pizarro was able to pretty easily conquer the native people of Inca territory. Spain didn't stop there, however. They moved northward, first into Florida. There was actually the belief that there was what was called a fountain of youth that would make you be able to stay young forever if you just drank from it. And so that drove Spaniards northwards. Now, Florida's territory was actually rather big compared to what it's considered to be now. So Spain first conquered or claimed Florida and then moved into Texas, or what's now considered to be Texas, laying claim along the way, searching, however, for what was considered to be the City of Gold, where the buildings were all made out of gold, the streets were lined with gold, riches beyond their wildest dreams. This led another Spanish conquistador named Coronado to go in search of it. He went with a priest by the name of Deniza. Deniza had already been there to a village in what was now considered New Mexico and reported back saying that this city of gold really did exist and that he could take Coronado to it. So he led Coronado there, and when Coronado got there, much to his dismay or dislike, it wasn't actually a city of gold. It was actually buildings made out of brick. So, as I said before, Florida's territory was actually much bigger back then. It included Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Florida. So many of the uh, Spanish troops that ended up making settlements would make forts called presidios. And along with Spanish conquistadors, another group that started coming over from Spain was what we call missionaries. So they would set up buildings and outposts that they would also call missionaries, which were places where they could pretty much self-sustain themselves through things like farming and agriculture, and essentially would try to teach the Native Americans and to convert them to Christianity. So the impact on the native people, which was the Pueblo people, was very, very negative. So I already mentioned how many natives died to disease, but also there was many conflicts from lack of mutual understanding between the two peoples. Now, Spain had already started to colonize much of America, and others in Europe had started to take notice and say, hey, we went in on that action as well. However, nobody could challenge Spain's military might in America, and so what they had to do was try to grab up what was left. So it kind of became a race to see who could gather the most, claim the most places in the New World first. Well, France was one of the next ones to get in on this. A man by the name of Jacques Cartier traveled to Northern America, specifically to what we consider now to be Canada. Well, Cartier's interactions with the natives was a lot more peaceful than the Spanish's had been. Whereas the Spanish had tried to conquer the native people, the French actually were coming seeking gold. However, they found that it was hard living in Canada, and essentially, rather than finding gold, they found another thing that was actually even more profitable than gold was, and that was the trade of beaver fur, so fur trading. So there was a local Native American tribe called the Huron, and instead of making them their enemies, what they did was they made them business partners. And so the Huron were able to essentially broker not only peace with the French, but they also were able to help them sell their and catch their beaver fur. However, the Huron had a long rivalry with another native tribe called the Iroquois. And so obviously this didn't make them very happy, but what the French did was they gave them weaponry that the Iroquois Indians or Native Americans had never seen before, such as rifles and stuff like that. So essentially they were able to scare off a lot of the Iroquois Indians because of the advanced weaponry. Another man by the name of De La Salle also kind of went into an area that we now consider to be Louisiana. So eventually the English got in on this action as well and started their first colony named Jamestown. However, Jamestown didn't happen right away. Actually, a man by the name of John Cabot had sailed to that northern part of America as well. And then after him, he ended up getting lost at sea. And then after him, there was another man by the name of Walter Raleigh, who sailed to a place called Roanoke and established a colony there. However, they didn't have enough supplies to last, so the colony didn't last very long. So Walter decided he was going to sail back home and bring supplies, more supplies. So he left a band of people there, intending to return shortly. However, 3 years later, he tried to sail back as he got caught up in England. And instead of being able to sail directly back, he ended up having to wait on a nearby island instead because of a storm that was passing through. So after the storm passed, and he was eventually 3 months later able to finally make it back to where Roanoke was, he came back to the colony only to find that it had been deserted. Well, he didn't know, and it's never been found out what happened to the people, as all that was left was a inscription on a local tree that didn't make much sense to historians later on. Now comes Jamestown. About something like 20 years later, the English decided to try to settle once again in America on the East Coast. So they set up a colony called Jamestown, which had extreme difficulty at first in things like, for example, finding food, and was in constant tension with the local natives, the Powhatan people. So this was the case until a man by the name of Captain John Smith kind of took charge in the village. And through taking charge in the village, he was able to kind of get them organized and essentially said, if you don't work, you don't eat. So this was extremely powerful, as the people that had originally came to the colony of Jamestown were either really wealthy people or people that had just been intent on finding gold. And so nobody was really like farmers and stuff like that. So upon making a journey out for food, John Smith had been captured by the local Native Americans and taken before their chief. Now, their chief was, according to story, and we went over this in class about whether or not this is the true story or not, the chief was getting ready to execute John Smith when his 11-year-old daughter, Pocahontas, who was said to have been his favorite daughter, threw herself over John Smith to save his life. So, after being let go by the Powhatan people, it was said that John Smith's relationship with Pocahontas grew until they were like brother and sister. So, with that being said, Pocahontas was willing to essentially trade with John Smith for the food that they needed to survive. So the colony of Jamestown was essentially saved. However, eventually, John Smith ended up hurting himself in an explosion, gunpowder explosion, which severely wounded his leg, and so he returned back to England. And without John Smith there to kind of keep up his deal with Pocahontas, who had been the savior of Jamestown, the Native Americans were more content just to let the Englishmen starve instead. Tensions got so tough that eventually Pocahontas was captured and taken prisoner by the settlers of Jamestown, And even though she was somewhat of a willing prisoner and a curious prisoner, she was very curious to learn about these Englishmen or these strange foreigners. And so while in captivity, she learned English, how to speak English. She ended up eventually even getting converting to Christianity. And then after she was released, the then new governor of Jamestown, John Rolfe, brokered a peace treaty with the Powhatan people, and that he would get married to Pocahontas. And essentially this, once again, saved Jamestown, as now they could move freely with the Native Americans, and they could essentially get the food they needed through trade. But they also discovered at that time something that would make them a bunch of money and draw more interest in the colony of Jamestown, and that was tobacco, which is what's called a cash crop. And so not only did the people of Jamestown become extremely interested in tobacco, but so did others in England. And so more and more people started to come over to Jamestown, to the colony. And so the population grew really rapidly, with them planting tobacco crops everywhere, including on the roads. Can you imagine it? The final country from Europe to kind of come over to America was the Netherlands. So a sailor by the name of Henry Hudson came over and settled by what we call the Hudson River. So he established the colony of New Netherlands. He was a Dutchman, because the Dutch are from the Netherlands. And essentially another business got established there called the Dutch West Indian Company. So the Dutch West Indian Company eventually sent a man over by the name of Peter Minuit to broker peace at all costs with the natives there. And so what Peter did was he essentially, similar to the French, made friends with the native people there who were the Iroquois. If you remember from earlier, these were the ones that were beefing with the French because of their alliance with the Huron people. So eventually a man by the name of Peter Stuyvesant, or as he was called, Peg-Leg Pete, or Silver Nails, because of the fact that he was missing one leg and had tacked a bunch of silver nails into his leg, his missing leg, essentially became the governor of New Netherlands. And so what he did was he was considered to be a grumpy old man, but he ran the colony rather well, and so it prospered under him. It was successful. And so what that means is that even though he wasn't very well liked, he was a good leader. And so, in fact, there was some people sometimes in his council who would sometimes disagree with him, and essentially he told them either fall in line and stop grumbling, or I'll send you back to England in pieces. So it was kind of either my way or the highway with him. Then King Charles II, who did not like the Netherlands or the Dutch people and wanted them out of the New World, then gave his brother James, who was the Duke of York, that territory that the New Netherlands was established on, if he could take it by force. So what James did was he had his troops go and essentially soak all the gunpowder of the Dutch people who were in that territory. And so, without even a single shot being fired, the Dutch surrendered the New Netherlands to the English, and it was renamed New York without even a shot being fired because they had no gunpowder left. One other important fact to keep in mind about New Netherlands is that the deal or the partnership between the Dutch and the Iroquois Indians worked out extremely well because of the fact that the French were also the Dutch's competitor in the fur trade business. That concludes the early colonies and everything pretty much, a quick summary of what you need to know about them. Thank you.